here, even if they're a little loud and distracting. Please bring them to worship. This morning we're going to finish the story of David in 2 Samuel, the end of 2 Samuel. I originally had thought about perhaps skipping the end of the story of David and starting to dig more deeply into the Psalms. We've done that a little bit over the last month. We've talked a little bit about the Psalms, some overview in some different Psalms. Next week, next Sunday, Sunday morning and Sunday evening sermons will both be about the Psalms in various aspects. And in our reading, of course, as we're reading through the Bible, next week is entirely Psalms. I hesitated to do that. I thought about doing more breaking it up and being more specific about the chronology as we're reading through the Bible. But ultimately, I wanted to keep things simple. I wanted to keep things very basic. They could fit on one half sheet of paper. So we're doing just the rest of the Psalms this week in our reading. So we're going to finish up the story of David today. And then next Sunday morning, next Sunday night, we'll talk about the Psalms, various aspects of the Psalms. As we are at the end of 2 Samuel 17 through the end of the book. We think about David's story. We're going to go over it very quickly as we're summarizing a lot of the main events. As I was thinking about this lesson and thinking about what to call it, I almost called it Learning from David's Failures. Of course, we started last week. We talked about the sin with Bathsheba. And really what follows out of the rest of his life is the consequences and fallout of that sin. And as we continue through the story with Absalom, which ends in 19, David reestablishes authority. Most of the rest of David's life following the events with Bathsheba are either fallout or repetitions or other consequences of David's failings. Some of them are a little bit more subtle. We'll go through as we go. This is the end of Absalom's story. Absalom, of course, has ousted David from Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 16. Hushai is a sort of an advisor, a counselor, a seer who basically tricks Absalom. He doesn't listen to the advice of this other guy who gives good advice. Listens to Hushai. David's able to escape. Absalom pursues David. And then there's a long drawn-out long drawn-out sort of chase. It is a battle too, I guess. Absalom is killed in the course of this. And David then is greatly grieving over Absalom. So much so that Joab, who is really, if you're looking at the life of David, Joab is like the second most important person in the book of 2 Samuel, really 1st and 2 Samuel. Joab, who is sort of the unsung hero of the story, the only adult in the room, the only one acting with any sort of maturity or long view of Israel's well-being. David, as he's grieving Absalom so much, Joab has to rebuke him. And he is, in essence, Joab says, look, you are grieving so much for Absalom. He's the one that caused civil war. He's the one that caused all this conflict and strife. Your people will leave you. They will leave you if you do not go out and greet them and celebrate the victory in battle. Joab's the only one who's willing to put aside emotion and think about the well-being of the kingdom. So David returns to Jerusalem. And toward the end of his story, his attitude over the course of the Absalom story is inconsistent. At the end of the story with Absalom, he's so in grief and he's so sad over the story of Absalom. But over the course of the story of Absalom, he was not always like that. There's a lot of inconsistency in how David treated his son Absalom. And really this shows us, like any other person, David's just a guy. He's not perfect. He's not supernatural. He's not better than anyone else. He's just a person who has the same sort of struggles, the same sort of difficulties. When Amnon and Tamar, that whole story that kicks it off, Amnon and Tamar, that whole horrible incident, David did not take a firm enough hand. He did not get in the middle of it as the father. He should have gotten in the middle of it, should have taken a firm hand, gotten involved, disciplined the people in that story, and put his authority forward and said, look, we can't be doing this. But he just sort of was hands off throughout that whole story. When Absalom took matters into his own hands, because David wouldn't deal with it, David didn't try to reconcile, so Absalom kills Amnon and he runs away. And David doesn't try to do anything to reconcile until Joab has to hire a woman to go tell him this story. And then David's like, oh yeah, I guess I should deal with that. Again, Joab being the adult in the room. When Absalom does come back to Jerusalem, David basically ignores him for 2 years. Despite how much he mourned Absalom's absence. Absalom's gone. I wish Absalom was here. And Joab's like, well, then deal with it. And then Absalom comes back, and David just ignores him for 2 years. Like, what are you doing, David? I thought you really cared about Absalom. And Absalom has to basically tell Joab, why am I back? Why am I here? I can't talk to my father. I can't talk to David. Why am I even back here? And then David, as he's distracted, he's lax, really hands off in his parenting. If there's anything to learn from David, well, we'll talk about it in a minute. His distraction, his laxity ultimately allows Absalom to basically scoop power out from under him, a bloodless coup where David, who knows what David's doing? He's just sort of doing his own thing. And Absalom convinces everybody, hey, you should be following me instead of David. And so David has to go on the run. And then after all of that fallout, the bloody civil war, David mourns more for Absalom than for all those who were killed on his side. Those who are fighting for him to be king, doesn't grieve any of them. He grieves Absalom, the ultimate instigator of all of this, although really it is David's laxity that starts all this. It's hard exactly to parse when things went so sideways for David. He clearly loved God. He clearly cared about what God wanted. He clearly wanted to do God's will. But maybe apathy, complacency, family. Man, how many times has this happened? Where family strife, family squabbles come between us and God. When our apathy and our unwillingness to be uncomfortable. I don't know if it's unwillingness to be uncomfortable. That doesn't really strike me as David. He doesn't seem to be one to shy away from conflict. But he just doesn't really involve himself in any of his family difficulties. And his apathy, his complacency really lead him into a lot of heartache and a lot of difficulty. He ignored his responsibility. And again, if we're thinking about taking away lessons from David's life, toward the end of his life, this is the main one. Do not ignore your parental responsibility. Or if you're not a parent, don't ignore the responsibility you have in situations where you're in authority. When there's conflict and you're in authority, you don't get to be hands off. You need to involve yourself to make sure things go well. Proverbs 19:18, discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. I wonder, as these proverbs are being written, many of them written by Solomon, I wonder if Solomon is thinking about David, his father, and how these things played out in David's life, because David refused to discipline. Ultimately, he did. He refused to discipline first Amnon, then Absalom, and just allowed these things to fester and persist. Proverbs 23:13, do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. Ephesians 6:1-4, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with the promise that it may go well with you. You may live long in the land. But fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. David failed at not provoking his children to anger. In fact, I think it's David's behavior in large part that lead Absalom into such anger. David does not deal with Amnon. David ignores Absalom. And ultimately, it's David's refusal to be involved that leads Absalom into the things that he does, because he was unwilling to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And really, when we're thinking about this, I ultimately decided to go a slightly different way in thinking about this sermon. The kindness and severity of God, which is on display in the life of David. Again, the stuff with Absalom in large part comes about because of David's sin with Bathsheba. It was a discipline. It was a punishment. And Nathan says to David, right, when God tells Nathan, the sword will not depart from you your whole life. You don't get to build a temple. The sword will not depart from you. You will be at conflict your whole life. Because of his sin with Bathsheba, it was the Lord's discipline. And as an example for us to be involved in the situations where we have authority. Hebrews 12:5-8. Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord. Don't be weary when reproved by him. The Lord disciplines the ones he loves. This is what David needed to do. He chastises every son whom he receives. And as parents, especially for parents, if you love your children, discipline them. Do not let your children just do whatever they want. That's what David did, and it ultimately, now in your case, it's not going to lead to civil war, hopefully. But ultimately, David did not discipline, and it did not go well. God disciplines those he loves. In the case of David, that discipline ultimately beginning with the death of the child that he had with Bathsheba, but really playing out in perpetuity in the life of David. Yet, of course, David did not abandon his love for God, and we could say that, I think that was a good thing about David ultimately, that he was not weary when reproved by the Lord. He did not despair when God disciplined him. even though he didn't really follow through with that example in his own life. It is for discipline you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. What son is there whom his father does not discipline? What's the implied answer? There is an answer. It's the son whom the father does not love. Right? Isn't that the implied answer? What son is there whom his father does not discipline? The one who is unloved, his father does not discipline. If you are left without discipline in which all have participated, you are illegitimate children and not sons. God is kind and forgiving and gracious, but he is also severe in that he does not let wrongdoing go. He does not. He disciplines. When we fail, we make mistakes, we sin. It's hard to recognize exactly how this plays out. For David, of course, we just get to know because God tells us. In our own lives, it's harder to see the discipline of the Lord, but know that it's there. And that when you're feeling consequences of your sin, sometimes that's probably because God is disciplining you to show you you need to come back to him. You need to come back to doing what's right. Ultimately, our allegiance is not to our families, but to Yahweh above all. And again, I think we see this in the life of David, even though he doesn't play it out exactly right. Matthew 10:34, do not think I've come to bring peace. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Of course, in the life of David, this is very literal. This is not going to be exactly the same for us. A person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What's the point? We can't let fear of conflict, which again I think we see in the life of David, we can't let an aversion to discomfort and conflict prevent us from living the kinds of lives that God wants us to. We can't let fear of conflict get in the way of us and God. And a lot of times this happens in families because we'd rather have peace in our own family, but that means I can't go to worship. It means I can't be a Christian. It means I can't be involved in the church. It means I can't be doing what God wants, because if I do that, it'll cause conflict in the family. That's exactly Jesus' point. Sometimes to follow God, to do what God wants, will require conflict. Do you love God more, or do you love your family more? It's a very simple question, hard to answer, of course. Simple question, complex answers. The remainder of David's story then, in 2 Samuel, from this point on, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, almost seems like just a series of vignettes, a series of stories, not really a cohesive narrative. It's hard to know. Well, some of it for sure is out of order. David's mighty men, which Chronicles has way earlier in the narrative, because David's mighty men are all doing stuff in the narrative. But less a series of a systematic narrative and more just, here's some things that happened in David's life. After this point in 2 Samuel 20, we have the rebellion of Sheba, which he ultimately puts down. We have appeasing the Gibeonites. Interesting parts of this story where Israel is suffering under a famine because the Gibeonites were mistreated by Saul, and there has to be some reconciliation, restitution made for the Gibeonites. War with the Philistines in 2 Samuel 21. This is where we see the end of the Anakim, as far as we're aware, the end of the Anakim here. David's song and oracle in 22 and 23, just some psalms that are very much reminiscent of the Psalms, just dropped into the narrative in 2 Samuel. And then David's mighty men, just a list of guys who were helping David. These are the elite of the elites in helping David throughout his life. And then, of course, the story of David's census, which we'll talk about a little bit, one of the more unusual stories. And that is the end of 2 Samuel. Now, David is alive in the very beginning of 1 Kings. We're going to read all through the Psalms for the rest of this week, or not the rest of, for this week. And next week, we'll finish the Psalms in our reading. And then we'll talk about the life of Solomon in a couple weeks. David's census, this is the last story in this sort of concentrated section of David's life. Even the end of David's life in 1 Kings is really more about establishing and setting up what's going to come with Solomon. In many of the stories of David's life, especially toward the end, and this is where I really want to emphasize the kindness and severity of God in David's life, as he was gracious to David in some places and very harsh on David in others. This dual nature of God's character, really on display in a lot of the stories in David's life. And it goes back to, as many of the Old Testament passages do, the most quoted part of the Bible. When I say most quoted, I mean most quoted by other parts of the Bible. Exodus 34, 5 through 8. Yahweh descended in the cloud and stood with him there. This is Moses. Proclaimed to him the name of Yahweh. Yahweh passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. That first part, the kindness of God, the grace, the mercy, which we see on display in the life of David, who is free. Ultimately, he is forgiven. You're not going to die, forgiven for his sin. And again, over and over, as he is gracious to David and helps him in distress and helps him in trial. But that's not all of who God is, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. There's a lot of conflict that comes out of David's life because of who God is. Because when there is sin, there is consequence. And that consequence is not limited to us. The consequences of sin is far-reaching. Across time and location, generation after generation, civil war was ultimately the result of David's sin. Because God will by no means clear the guilty. And Moses' response is the one that David emulated. Moses quickly bowed down his head toward the earth and worshiped. And David, as his child dies, he's lamenting and fasting and has all the sackcloth and he's wailing and waiting and hoping and praying that God will not ultimately take his child from him. After the child dies, what does David do? He gets up, he washes his face, he puts on clothes, and he goes and worships. The kindness and severity of God, both on display in the life of David, ultimately should lead us to worship. Romans 11, 29 through 23, you will say, this is talking about the Jews rejecting Jesus for the Gentiles to come in, ultimately so that we, as I think most of us are Gentiles, I don't know if there's any people with Jewish descent here, for the vast majority of us as Gentiles, we came in because the Jews rejected, right? Jesus has died, he dies, he's killed, he's crucified, he's resurrected. We get to come into the family of God, and that's where Paul's speaking here. You will say, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. That's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. That is, the Jews did not believe Jesus, but you stand fast through faith. You believe, so that's great. But do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, that is, the Jews who he is their God for thousands of years, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. That is, God's kindness can again extend to the Jews. If they don't continue in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. In the life of David, God's kindness and severity, we can't expect to outrun our sin, but God ultimately does want to be kind. He will be severe if he has to. He will be severe if our behavior warrants it, but he does ultimately seek to be kind to us, forgiving and gracious and loving. Even though, as we know, our sin does have consequence. Jesus ultimately came to remove the most serious part of that consequence. To remove the consequence in eternity, the eternal separation from God. That's what Jesus came to remove. He did not really promise to remove some of the more earthly consequences for sin. If you commit murder, a consequence is, speaking of children being loud, we love you, Wade. Love you so much. If you commit murder, you go to jail. God did not promise, hey, I'll forgive you the murder, but he's not promised to get you out of jail. If you are unfaithful to your spouse and it destroys your marriage, and your family ultimately is broken, God will forgive you for that. He can reconcile you to himself, but he's not promised that your children will trust you again. He's not promised that your spouse will reconcile with you. There are consequences for sin that are a result of our failings and our difficulties that God does want to forgive, but he also is not going to remove those consequences because we need to learn the severity of sin, the seriousness of sin. And so David, despite his flaws, which were many, David's story in 2 Samuel does ultimately end with, what do we do when we have this sin and there's consequence and there's difficulty? How do we come back to God? How do we approach him? A profoundly important lesson about our relationship with God at the end of 2 Samuel, where this census, we're not going to talk about, there's a little bit of a confusion. If you want to talk about it, you can come talk to me between the account in 2 Samuel and in 1 Chronicles. We're not going to talk about that today. The point, though, as David has made the census, God is upset, God is angry, and there is a consequence that's imposed. God actually gives him a choice of 3 consequences. You can have loss in battle, you can have plague, you can have, I can't remember exactly the 3 choices. David ultimately says, well, let me fall into the hands of God. Maybe God will be gracious. And at the end of this, there is a lot of death. There's this plague that happens, and there's the angel striking the people of Israel. But God relents. He tells David, go and offer a sacrifice. I'm ready to forgive you. And so we pick up here, David has gone to Araunah, and he's gone there because God told him to go there. Go get this piece of land, offer the sacrifice. David goes to Araunah, and he says, well, let's pick it up here. Araunah said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? David said, to buy the threshing floor from you in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people. Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here, there are oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this Araunah gives to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. But the king said, no. It seems kind of weird, right? Araunah's wanting to offer all of this very graciously, very lovingly. No, I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that have cost me nothing. We think about the forgiveness, the kindness and severity of God. What was he willing to offer to make things right, to show his kindness to us? And then in return, we think to ourselves, what are we willing to offer to him in return? For the gracious gifts that we've been given, ultimate salvation from his severity, his judgment, his wrath, David demonstrating here an important principle that when it comes to our relationship to God, when it comes to returning to him, to seeking his forgiveness, seeking his kindness, it costs something. It should cost something because of who God is and who we are. He deserves gifts and sacrifices that hurt, that cost, we have to give something up. David recognized it would not really be a sacrifice if it came from Araunah. It would be Araunah's sacrifice, and he would be the one making that plea, but it wouldn't be a sacrifice of David if it did not cost him something. Hebrews 12:25 will end with this. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. If they did not escape when they refused him and warned on earth, thinking about the Israelites, a lot of the Hebrew stories, they go back to the Israelites, right? Thinking about the severity of God. They didn't escape when they refused him and warned them on earth. How much less will we escape if we reject him and warns from heaven? That is Jesus. If we reject Jesus. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. What is this all saying? We're dropping it in here in Hebrews 12, a little bit out of context. In the Old Testament, they had punishment, they had consequence, they had difficulty because of their sin. Ultimately, that was all physical in nature. God took the kingdom, or he struck them with plague. Ultimately, we're talking about on Mount Sinai, and if you come near, you'll die. Yet once more, though, Jesus, who warns from heaven, when the end comes and finally his severity is revealed and kindness for all, that'll be it. Everything will be gone. One more time. Once more. I will shake, I will remove everything in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain, in order that God's ultimate good creation, the thing that he's building for us and his people, can remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. Note the kindness and severity of God. Kindness in giving us a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Here we are in the kingdom of Jesus, receiving forgiveness, receiving grace, receiving mercy, as David ultimately did. But note the severity. Yet once more, I will shake. I will remove. Don't be proud, but fear. Because if God was able to remove them who did not believe, he will remove us who do not believe. Let us offer to God acceptable worship. And what is acceptable worship? Not the same thing exactly as David, but as we're coming to God, what does it cost us? What are we willing to give up? What are we willing to sacrifice to approach him? And if the answer is nothing, you're not really coming to God. If there's nothing that you're willing to give up, if you just do it if it's comfortable, you just do it if it's easy, I just do it because I feel good, that's not really what God's looking for. He's looking for those who are willing to give up anything and everything to come to him, because he is a consuming fire. As we offer the invitation, yet once more, I don't know when that will be. When could that be? It could be someday. Maybe I'm going to be right about this. Maybe not, though. The odds are not in my favor. Maybe it's now. Nope, not then. Could be 1,000 years from now. I don't know. Could be this afternoon. Are you ready for the removal of that which can be shaken? I hope you are. If you're not, let's make it right. Come to God. Repent, confess, be immersed into him, knowing that you can be a part of the kingdom that can't be shaken, but also knowing that if we do not continue in that belief, we can be cut off again. If you need help, come while we stand and sing.